I closed my eyes and let the lake sound do what it always did, pull the rough edges off my day until everything felt possible again. The dock beneath my feet creaked in that familiar, comforting rhythm, wood settling, water breathing. And for a moment, I could almost pretend nothing had changed since I was a child, learning knots here with my grandfather. The truth was uglier and closer than the water. The orange tape around the entrance, the locked gate where our family had walked freely for 80 years. The HOA president had wrapped my childhood in plastic and declared it theirs. They called it community access. I called it theft. The first time I tried to reason with them, I wore patience like armor. I sat through the meeting in the church basement, fluorescent lights, stale coffee, folding chairs so tired they complained when you shifted. The HOA president, Derek Mallory, smiled like it was a public service announcement. He spoke in the low, practiced cadence of a man who'd never been questioned and didn't like it. He talked about shared assets, safety concerns, and equal access, pointed at charts and waved through permits he produced as if paper could blunt the fact that my dock's pilings still had my family's surveyor's stamp nailed to the beam when I asked to see the deed that gave them the right to close my dock. He patted the manila folder with casual contempt. "You won't find a deed," he said. "You'll find rules, covenants, time-tested easements recorded in the 1992 amendment." Everyone nodded. My voice felt small in that room, like a pebble thrown at a window. "Your easement refers to common walkways," Derek said, "not private docks." I asked him to point to the line. He couldn't. He smiled instead, and chair after chair returned to its polite sleep. They thought that would be enough. They were wrong. I spent nights hunched over my kitchen table, aquatic moonlight slicing through the blinds, pulling up records on my laptop. Public land records are boring until they stop being boring. Then they're dangerous. There are numbers and signatures and abbreviations that read like incantations until you learn the language. Dedication, right-of-way, riparian rights, words that made my jaw tighten because they had the power to solve the problem or to trap you in a bureaucratic maze forever. My grandfather had taught me about the lake the way he taught me to cuss, with affection and bluntness. "Water remembers," he'd say, lighting his pipe, "and law remembers. Keep both close." I'd never understood how literal that was until I found the original plat maps. The deed to our lot, Lot 14, was stamped, signed, and filed in the county recorder's office in 1946. The dock and the 20 feet of shore access were specifically described. The deed talked about mooring rights in the inlet, a narrow clause that meant a lot more than it looked like. Riparian rights are stubborn. They cling to property like barnacles. They say you don't need a piece of paper to point out a lake and claim it if your deed and your history do the pointing for you. That made me smile quietly for the first time. But Derek's people were creative. They hadn't forged the plat. They'd forged the narrative, somewhere between the HOA's minutes and the county's careless indexing. Someone had slipped in a community safety amendment that conveniently placed the Marina under HOA control and, more importantly, placed access to docks and slips under a nebulous community management clause. It wasn't signed by the right people. It wasn't even recorded in the right place. But it was enough to scare most folks into compliance until I learned to read the fine print like you read a weather report. I learned to use people the way lawyers use motions, precisely, strategically, and without malice that might complicate evidence. I made a list: county recorder, land surveyor, a retired title examiner I found online named June Park, who took a strange delight in cleaning up sloppy records, environmental inspector, the man I'd been warned away from as a kid, the county attorney who'd once run for judge and lost, but still carried the kind of quiet weaponry that makes bureaucrats nervous. I started calling names in the kind of soft, steady voice that says I'm not a threat until I am. June Park came to the property with magnifying glasses and history in her pockets. She smelled like lemon oil in autumn. She leafed through the plat with a reverence that made me proud and decided, with the finality of someone closing an old trunk, that the HOA's amendment was a later insertion, not a lawful change. "They didn't follow the chain," she said. "Signatures don't match. Witnesses are wrong. This was patched by someone who knew how documents should look but didn't know the law." She could have emailed me the findings. Instead, she sat with me on the dock and told me stories of similar fights she'd won for people who believed their land was sacred. "People who know their rights rarely lose," she said, and I put that on a sticky note. My first move was administrative. I filed a formal complaint with the county recorder to void the HOA amendment. I demanded a forensic comparison of signatures. I paid for it out of my pocket because when you do the math of outrage versus cost, you figure out pretty quickly whether you'll simply be right or you'll be right in court. Derek noticed almost immediately. He called himself conciliatory on the first voicemail, then colder the second time. "We're willing to work this out," he said, but his "work this out" sounded like, "You'll go quietly." They had overplayed their hand. The Marina's insurance paperwork, which was posted on the HOA's public binder, or at least had been until someone pulled it, had been inconsistent with state marina codes. There were violations listed in small print: inadequate fire access, improperly anchored fuel tanks, missing spill contingency plans. The HOA had spent money on a glossy brochure and not on the things that actually mattered when something went wrong. I saw an opening, and I did what I'd eventually learned to do best. I connected the dots. A local fisherman, Ben Reyes, had been grumbling about the Marina's dock extension for months because every time he launched his skiff, he had to avoid a newly installed pile of pilings that stuck out like teeth. Ben had an easy laugh and an inconvenient memory. He remembered when the dredging for the Marina had been approved, and he also remembered that the proper environmental impact statement had not been completed. "They paid a consultant," he said one evening over cheap beer, "but they paid him in the dark. I saw no permits on the county board for the depth of that channel. Environmental violations, it turns out, open doors wide enough for a truck to drive through. I filed a complaint with the state environmental agency about unpermitted dredging and about potential pollution risks from improperly stored fuel. I asked that they inspect the marina. Then I did something smaller and more surgical. I filed a demand for records under the Freedom of Information Act. Bureaucracy loves to keep secrets, but it hates to be asked for everything in writing. When the state requested records in their formal review, the HOA produced a pile of paperwork that had been assembled quickly. Like a magician shoving objects into a hat, I watched them frantically patch the hat. The forgery experts took longer than I liked. When the county's forensic examiner finally called, his voice carried the professional amusement of someone who enjoys stomping on sloppy criminals. "Signatures don't match," he said. "Ink composition varies in a way that indicates different dates and a different pen. There's more than one hand. Whoever filed this knew the right names to use, but not how to make them look like one continuous story." That phone call was a kind of thunderbolt. The HOA was vulnerable in a way that meant more than losing custody of a dock. But I wanted more than the revocation of their false amendment. I wanted them exposed. I wanted Derek to understand what it felt like to be stripped of the power he'd used like a cudgel. There is cruelty in revenge if you let it live inside you like a poison. I kept my cruelty trimmed to necessary edges. The rest I boiled down to a legal equivalent of slow, inexorable water. Pressure, erosion, and then collapse. I piled lawsuits on top of each other with the care of someone building a structure. An injunction to bar the HOA from interfering with my dock. A civil suit for trespass and conversion of property, a petition to the county to revoke marina operational permits until they complied with safety and environmental regulations, an expert affidavit about riparian rights. I worked with the county attorney, retired as I said, but with teeth, who filed a motion to have a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. I wanted to know where the money had gone and whether the marina's operations were being subsidized by improper assessments. News travels fast in a small lake community, and when it's your fight, the right neighbors come forward. A dietitian who ran a B&B on the next inlet had her private boat slip charged as a community fee, despite explicit assurances when she bought her house. An elderly veteran had been fined for unauthorized storage of his dinghy when he'd kept it on his own lot for 20 years. Little by little, what looked like isolated overreach formed a pattern. The HOA's ledger began to look less like stewardship and more like a ledger used by people who thought rules were suggestions for the passengers, not for themselves. Derek, of course, laughed when he heard that people were filing complaints. He laughed like a man tightening a noose while the rest of us worried about the weather. He doubled down on his PR campaign, glossy newsletters, community meetings with catered food, and a new fence that looked designed to impress. He painted the narrative of an embattled board protecting the community from selfish property owners. When neighbors started whispering about him in small groups, He brought in a public relations consultant who smelled of citrus and was paid in checks I later learned were written to P.O. boxes that didn't match any real company, did what any pragmatic person would do in a fight. That has turned political. I weaponized records. Real estate deals leave fingerprints, bank transfers, approved invoices, contractor names. I subpoenaed bank statements and invoices through the litigation process and started tracing the money. It led to landscaping companies, yes, but also to a private account Derek used for community events that, according to invoices, had been funneled into personal expenses. A weekend retreat for board cohesion, a boat refurbishment billed as Marina, aesthetic upgrades, and, most damning, a payment to a company that had produced an easement clarification document that now looked under scrutiny, suspiciously like the amendment they'd used to lock my dock. When the subpoenas landed, people began to panic. The board members, previously comfortable in their consensus, started to squeal with the kind of mild terror you hear from animals that realize fences can be opened. I watched Derek crumble in public with a kind of fascinated satisfaction. He had always been good at projecting calm. He was a master of the broad smile, but in private his emails revealed the tightness behind the smile, scrawled hopes, a fear that someone would follow the paper trail he thought he'd buried. The night before the first big hearing, I paced in my house like someone listening for thunder. I had stacked everything I could: legal motions, environmental complaints, forensic reports, witness statements. I had strategy, and the law had a tendency to favor the person who could turn chaos into a sequence of inevitable steps. I wanted the dock back, yes, but more than that, I wanted accountability. The law is a rough tool for moral satisfaction, but it is surprisingly good at enforcement when wielded carefully. Courtrooms are theaters of controlled anger. They are where people perform their grievances, where sworn testimony slices through the drama and leaves behind a cold, measurable result. The first hearing was procedural, but the prosecutor's questions landed like gut punches. The forensic examiner testified about the signatures. June Park walked through the title chain with the clear authority of someone who had read the past and found it altered. The county environmental officer presented photographs of fuel drums stored near the launch ramp with no containment. The HOA's representative, Derek, fumbled with his jacket pocket like a man trying to hold himself together. My attorney, a woman named Laura, who preferred coffee black and facts like weapons, asked pointed questions that made Derek shuffle. "You authorized payment to Marina Clarifications, LLC on July 22nd, she said. Derek answered because he had to. Yes. And who owns Marina Clarifications? He hesitated, then named a shell company. We had the shell company's director on a separate subpoena, and he had a ledger that made Derek's connection plain. The judge's gavel was a sound that made my childhood seem very far away. He issued a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from restricting my access to the dock while the case proceeded. That was the first small electric victory. Standing on the shoreline when the sheriff unlocked the gate felt like sunlight after heavy weather. A crowd had gathered, neighbors who had once avoided conflict, fishermen with tired faces, the B&B owner with a quiet smile. I stepped onto my dock with both hands in my pockets, the wood giving a familiar resistance under my soles. I didn't dance. I didn't gloat. I let the water slap the pilings and tasted victory like a plain, sharp thing, but the fight was only beginning. The audit of the HOA's finances was, in one word, devastating. There were assessment fees that didn't match the improvements listed in the minutes, invoices with missing tax IDs, and contractors who swore under oath they'd been paid by checks that never cleared. We found insurance claims that had been denied for sloppy reporting, and in one jaw-dropping find, a contractor testified that he'd been asked to backdate a permit application to make a dredging job look compliant. The contractor, under oath, named Derek as the one who'd asked him to alter documents to match a timeline that never existed. The county attorney filed criminal charges: falsifying public records, forgery, and making false statements to a government agency. Those charges were the kind that carry a public stigma, and the community, previously split into polite factions, turned with a kind of sudden moral unanimity. The man who'd enjoyed being dressed up as a steward of order now stood accused of manufacturing chaos. Derek fought back in the court of public opinion. He hired lawyers, hired PR, paid for lawn signs that read "Protect Our Marina," and tried to scare people into thinking that the only alternative to the HOA's control was chaos. But the evidence was a bright, inexorable thing. Photographs, bank transfers, emails. These are the kinds of things that don't bend under pressure. In the end, the county's prosecution was thorough and relentless. Derek was indicted. The local paper ran the headline the morning after the arraignment. Former HOA president faces forgery charges. The irony tasted like salt. There were other consequences that, to me, were the true justice. The Marina's permits were revoked pending a full environmental and safety compliance review. The state won a temporary receivership to run the Marina's operations, which meant game over for Derek's private accounts and off-books improvements. The HOA lost its ability to manage the Marina until it could prove, with audits and new board elections and transparency reforms, that it wasn't a private club masquerading as community stewardship. The repair bill for the environment, undone dredging, fuel containment, proper fire lanes, was theirs to fight for, not mine to endure. But justice is never just legal. Real justice smells of repair. The docks that had been closed were cleaned up and reopened under a new democratically elected board. The Marina's operations were handed to a professional manager with experience in compliance and environmental stewardship, who introduced training and safety protocols. The veteran who'd been fined for keeping his dinghy got a public apology and the fine refunded. The B&B owner's private slip was returned with a letter acknowledging the improper assessment and the board's error. Those small restitutions mattered more than headlines. They were the stitches in the community I'd grown up in. There was a day, months after the indictments, when Derek came to collect his things from the little office above the Marina. He was not handcuffed. Criminal proceedings move at their own glacial speed. But the look on his face was not the calculated, easy smile I'd seen at the beginning. He was smaller, more raw, like someone who'd had an actor's mask stripped away. He lingered at the doorway of the office and looked out at the lake. "You could have come to me," he said. "We could have worked it out." I thought of 100 answers and said none of them. All I could hear was the wood of my dock in the water, and in that sound there was no joy in his fall. The kind of victory I wanted was not to watch him burn. It was to watch the community remember how to govern itself without him. So I nodded once and turned back to the water. In court, the forensics were decisive. Derek had been careful, but not careful enough to be invisible. The jury found him guilty on several counts. He received a sentence that included restitution and community service, and the judge ordered that he never hold an office of fiduciary duty for a homeowners association in the county again. I read the sentence out of curiosity, and a slow, private satisfaction bloomed inside me like the oath of an old bell. There are people who think revenge is a private thing, a secret fire you feed alone. I found that revenge, to feel like justice, must be public enough to set a precedent. The law became a public ledger of his misdeeds in a way that made it difficult for him to walk away and smile. The same neighbors who had been cowed by his charm now walked past him with a new steadiness. The man who'd once had the power to close a gate now had to answer to the law and to his community for the choices he'd made. Standing on the dock the week after the verdict, I watched a small boy climb clumsily onto the pilings to fish with his father. The breath between them was easy. The dock was once again a place of ordinary life. My grandfather's old wooden boat, repaired and returned, bobbled at the end of my line. The sun dropped and the water turned the color of old coins. Justice, I discovered, doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like people going back to normal after a long, ugly interruption. I didn't gloat. I didn't take pleasure in Derek's inconvenience beyond the satisfaction that comes with accountability. Instead, I sat on the edge of the dock, feet dangling, and let the lake remember me. I thought about what we reclaimed. Not only timber and pilings, but trust. The community had been wounded by an authority that mistook its position for ownership. We repaired the wound with law and with shared work, and with a new system that required transparency in audits and term limits. We made it harder for someone to replace stewardship with self-interest under the banner of community. There is a small, wry joke my grandfather used to make about vengeance. If you want revenge, plant a garden, then enjoy the harvest. I planted no garden, but over the following months I watched the community grow back like a tended plot. The Marina hosted a beach cleanup, a potluck, and a safety workshop that Derek would have mocked, but that honestly made the place better. He watched from the outer lane, a man who had learned that power is not about announcements but about trust. In the quiet after, a reporter once asked me if I regretted the escalation, if I would have done anything differently. I thought about the nights with maps spread like conspiracies, the expense of forensic examiners, the witness statements, the calls to officials who were politely bored until they weren't. I thought about Derek's smile and the way it had masked a willingness to bend the law until it fit him. I would have acted sooner, I said. I would have listened to the lake sooner. That was true. Complacency is a slow thief. The last time I walked down the lane to the dock was in the kind of weather that made the lake look honest. Clouds broken by light, a steady breeze pushing ripples to shore. A little girl was learning to tie a bowline under the watchful eye of her grandfather. The marina hummed with small pleasures. The HOA is different now. New faces, an elected board with clear rules, a yearly external audit. People still argue, neighbors always will, but their arguments are about grass height and boat spacing, not about forged documents and secret bank accounts. When the whole thing began, I wanted only what my family had always had, a place to launch a boat, a place to salt my hair and remember my grandfather's laugh. By the time it ended, I had something else, a community that could no longer be quietly appropriated by a slick smile and a forged amendment. I had justice, and with it the slow, steady comfort of living in a place where the law can be used, finally, as a tool to mend what was broken. The lake kept breathing. The dock kept creaking. When a storm came a month later and knocked a small section loose, the entire community showed up with tarps and tools. We fixed that dock with more hands than I had expected, laughter and curses and the smell of fresh-cut timber. Derek watched from a distance, a man who was reduced to the status of neighbor, not boss. He could do what he wanted with his conscience. I could only do what I'd always done, show up, work, and insist that things be right. There is power in insisting. There is a kind of grace in making the hard choice to see rules enforced and to ask for evidence when someone claims authority. The worst thing Derek had done wasn't seize a dock. It was underestimate us. He thought we would let our memories be edited because it was easier, because he had the right clothes and the right papers. He was wrong. The law remembers. The lake remembers. So do I. When I tie my boat to the cleat now, I do it with a small private ritual. A quick look back at the shore where my house sits, a nod to the men and women who helped, and a breath like a benediction. The dock will age. The pilings will weather. New disputes will come, as they always do. But tonight the pilings stand, and the gate is unlocked, and the water that remembers washes them in and out in a rhythm that says we were right to fight. And that justice, when demanded thoughtfully, can return more than what was taken. After the first courtroom victory, I could feel the shift in the neighborhood like a slow tide creeping up ashore. People who had once smiled politely while Derek pontificated now leaned in when I spoke, nodding at the details I'd uncovered. Mrs. Carmichael from across the inlet, a woman with a garden that smelled perpetually of basil and rosemary, cornered me one morning with a stack of HOA newsletters. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she handed me the papers. "They've been misreporting expenses for years, and now—" "Well, it looks like you're finally proving it." Her smile was cautious but determined, like someone testing the wind before sailing. Small victories began piling up like sediment. The veteran neighbor, Mr. Peters, had his fines formally refunded after I supplied the court with copies of the original property agreements. It was almost mundane, but the look on Derek's face when the letter arrived was priceless, a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. I began to realize that justice has a rhythm, and sometimes it moves in quiet, seemingly minor beats before the grand crescendo. I also noticed Derek starting to unravel in subtle ways. At the monthly HOA meeting, he tried to project confidence, using the same easy smile that had once intimidated me. But it faltered when June Park's forensic report was referenced publicly. Board members whispered to one another. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Derek attempted to downplay the discrepancies, but his voice, once steady, cracked like thin ice under pressure. Each misstep he made, I recorded quietly, knowing that someday these small pieces would fit into a pattern too glaring to ignore. Fishermen and boat owners, initially wary of taking sides, started to approach me with tips. A contractor paid in cash for marina improvements that never appeared, receipts with suspiciously rounded totals, email threads showing deliberate misinformation. Every revelation was a small puzzle piece. And as I assembled them, a picture emerged. The HOA had built a castle on sand. Thinking no one could see the foundation was rotting, the tension escalated when Derek tried to intimidate me directly. One afternoon, as I approached the dock, a truck blocked my path. Derek stepped out, hands on his hips, the sun casting long shadows across the gravel. "You think you can keep filing complaints and digging through records and get away with it?" he said, voice low but firm. I smiled lightly, leaning casually on my car. "I don't think, Derek, I know," I replied. The corner of his mouth twitched, and I could see the first flicker of doubt cross his eyes. He barked a final warning, turned on his heel, and left. That day, I realized he had underestimated not just my determination, but the collective awareness of the neighborhood that I had quietly rallied. With momentum on my side, I organized a small community gathering at the dock. Neighbors came with coffee and sandwiches, curious and cautious. I didn't speak much at first, just listened as they aired grievances and shared experiences, some mundane, some infuriating. Then I laid out what I'd discovered: the forged documents, unapproved expenditures, environmental violations, and misrepresented permits. People gasped, shook their heads, whispered among themselves. The energy shifted. What had been private frustrations turned into a shared sense of righteous indignation. We formed an informal coalition, each of us contributing in ways we could. Mr. Peters, retired and meticulous, began documenting every interaction with the HOA. Mrs. Carmichael, skilled in administration, compiled records and receipts into neat chronological folders. Ben Reyes and other fishermen offered eyewitness accounts of dredging and obstruction practices. I coordinated legal documents and motions with Laura, my attorney, ensuring that each small act of opposition fed into the larger strategy. Meanwhile, Derek's desperation became increasingly visible. He began sending frantic emails to board members, trying to rewrite history, scare residents, and maintain control. But the more he pushed, the more evidence I could produce. Each email, each misstep was carefully cataloged. I even started to notice the way his minions avoided my gaze at public events. A subtle but telling shift in the dynamics of fear and respect. By the end of the month, we had achieved something remarkable. The HOA's authority, once untouchable, was now visibly questioned. Notices of complaints appeared on bulletin boards, neighbors started attending meetings en masse, and Derek's carefully constructed image of omnipotence began to crumble. There was no need for loud confrontation. The truth was louder than any yell could be. One quiet evening, standing on the dock after everyone had left, I watched the water reflect the orange sunset. The gentle lapping against the pilings reminded me why this fight mattered, not for ego, not for vengeance alone, but for preservation of memory, tradition, and fairness. I had small wins now, but the real battle, the legal and strategic dismantling of Derek's grip, was still ahead. The tide was turning, slowly but unmistakably, and I was ready for the storm that would follow. Court days are never quiet. Even in small towns, a courtroom carries the weight of ritual and anticipation. The polished wood, the scratch of pens on pads, the faint scent of old leather and dust. The day of the first big hearing, I arrived early, dressed in a simple blazer, feeling the kind of nervous excitement you only get when you know the tide has already turned in your favor. Derek arrived in a rented suit that was 2 sizes too big, an attempt at projecting authority he clearly didn't feel. His minions sat stiffly behind him, hands folded, eyes darting to me like children caught sneaking candy. Laura, my attorney, had meticulously prepared every document. Evidence was laid out in neat piles: scanned letters, environmental reports, notarized statements, and the forensic examination of the HOA amendment. Each item told a story. Each page built the narrative of deliberate overreach. When she spoke, she didn't just argue law, she narrated truth. And in that room, truth has an undeniable gravity. The hearing began with procedural motions, but it didn't take long for the tension to sharpen. The county examiner was first, presenting a detailed report on the forged signatures. As the images of the documents flashed on the screen, the room fell silent. The examiner's voice was calm, precise, unwavering. The amendments submitted by the HOA contain at least 4 separate signatures that are inconsistent with verified originals. The discrepancies indicate intentional alteration, not clerical error. Derek's face twitched imperceptibly. I felt a quiet thrill. Truth had a way of cutting deeper than anger. Next came June Park, the retired title examiner, who walked us through the chain of property ownership with clarity that bordered on artistry. Lot 14 has been in the plaintiff's family since 1946, she explained, pointing to the plat maps projected onto the wall. All rights to access, mooring, and dock usage are clearly defined. The so-called HOA amendment does not conform to proper recording procedures and therefore holds no legal authority. There was a collective murmur in the courtroom, a recognition that authority cannot exist without legality. Derek's hands clenched on the table in front of him. Then came the environmental inspector. I held my breath as she presented photographs of fuel containers stored illegally, dredging operations conducted without permits, and safety violations at the Marina. Each violation, while technical, carried severe legal consequences. I could see Derek shifting in his seat, a man trying to appear calm while the floor crumbled beneath him. The inspector's testimony concluded with a final, sharp statement: if these operations continue without correction, the Marina must cease functioning until compliance is achieved. That was the first hammer strike. Lara stood, her eyes scanning the room, and delivered the cross-examination with a surgeon's precision. She asked Derek questions about payments to shell companies, about documents that had been backdated, about correspondence that suggested deliberate concealment. He stammered. One answer led to another mistake. One misstep led to another admission. The gallery could feel it. The slow, terrifying realization that the man who had ruled the Marina with arrogance was now unraveling under scrutiny. I sat silently, letting the evidence speak. Each email, each falsified document, each misreported expense added weight to a narrative that Derek could no longer spin into fiction. I had watched him control meetings with charm, but charm is a fragile veneer when legal scrutiny strips it away. By the end of the day, the judge had issued a temporary injunction, preventing the HOA from interfering with my dock while the full case proceeded. I exhaled a long breath, feeling both relief and the rush of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of depositions, motions, and legal filings. Derek's attempts at counterclaims were weak, hastily constructed, and riddled with inconsistencies that Lara exposed with surgical efficiency. One day, during a deposition, a contractor confirmed under oath that Derek had asked him to backdate a dredging permit and falsify safety reports. The man spoke clearly, calmly, without malice, just truth. Derek's face went pale, and the tension was so palpable that the court reporter paused, pen hovering, almost sensing history being made. The community played its part quietly, providing statements, submitting records, and attending hearings. Each resident's testimony added another brick to the wall against Derek's authority. They spoke of unfair fines, hidden fees, and intimidation tactics. Together, these stories formed a tapestry of deliberate mismanagement, and for the first time, the neighborhood truly understood the full scale of what had been happening under the guise of community stewardship. By the third major hearing, Derek was visibly strained. His once smooth confidence had given way to twitching hands and clipped answers. His minions, too, began to falter, some caught contradicting earlier statements. The evidence was not just mounting, it was undeniable. My legal team moved strategically, presenting a flow of facts that left the board and Derek scrambling, desperately trying to contain damage that was already systemic. The breakthrough came when a forensic accountant testified about misappropriated funds. Each dollar unaccounted for, each inflated invoice, each redirected payment painted a picture of willful deceit. The courtroom was still for a long moment, and I realized with a quiet, almost surreal satisfaction that Derek's empire, built on arrogance, deception, and fear, was crumbling in the light of transparency and law. After weeks of hearings, motions, and counter-motions, the judge handed down a series of rulings that finally tilted the balance irreversibly. The HOA was ordered to cease Marina operations immediately until compliance was verified. Derek faced civil penalties, restitution payments, and restrictions on holding fiduciary positions in the county. And most importantly, my dock, my family's dock, was legally restored to my control, free from interference. Standing there, reading the court order in my hands, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Justice, painstakingly earned, had finally arrived. But the fight had done more than reclaim a dock. It had exposed corruption, restored community oversight, and reasserted the principle that authority is nothing without accountability. Derek would have his reputation forever tarnished. and the neighborhood would remember what happens when arrogance meets determination. The legal battle had been brutal, slow, and exhausting, but the law, when understood and wielded correctly, is a weapon that can achieve more than anger or threats ever could. Each courtroom victory, each piece of evidence, and each testimony had built toward the same end: full justice. And as I looked out at the restored Marina, seeing neighbors quietly returning to their routines, I knew that the fight had been worth every sleepless night, every tense phone call, and every ounce of strategy poured into reclaiming what was rightfully ours. The morning the inspectors arrived to enforce the court order, I was already standing on the dock before sunrise, coffee in hand, the water reflecting the first hints of gold. The marina had been quiet for weeks, but today there was movement. State environmental officers, safety inspectors, and legal representatives forming a slow, deliberate procession toward the docks. Derek arrived last, flanked by a few board members, his face a tight mask of disbelief and panic. The first order of business was a full audit of the marina's operations. Every slip, every fuel tank, every storage locker was examined. Photos were taken, logs were inspected, and compliance forms were checked line by line. The violations that had once been hidden or ignored now appeared glaring and indisputable. Fuel storage lacked proper containment, dredging permits were incomplete, safety ladders on certain docks were missing, and emergency plans hadn't been filed. Each report generated a small public strike against the HOA, and with each strike, Derek's composure frayed further. I watched quietly from the edge of my dock, feeling a steady satisfaction. Justice has a rhythm, and today the rhythm was mine. State inspectors shut down sections of the marina that were unsafe or illegal, redirecting boats and preventing anyone from circumventing the law. Staff who had been complicit in Derek's schemes were barred from operating without retraining and official oversight. Slowly, deliberately, the entire operation ground to a halt. Derek tried to bark orders, to rally his board, to assert some semblance of control. "This is temporary. It's just a bureaucratic delay," he shouted, but the inspectors ignored him. The law was no longer negotiable. His voice, which had once carried authority over the marina like a fog over water, now sounded hollow and frantic. Board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing that they were no longer shields but targets of scrutiny themselves. Meanwhile, I coordinated with Lara and local officials to ensure that the process was airtight. Every document, every violation, every procedural step had been anticipated. When one inspector paused, unsure about a particular procedural nuance, I stepped in calmly with the exact regulation citation. Derek's eyes narrowed. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that this fight was no longer about charm, influence, or intimidation. It was about facts, procedure, and unassailable evidence. The climax came when the state revoked the HOA's operational permits for the marina. Derek's empire, built on arrogance, manipulation, and forged paperwork, had crumbled. Boats could not be launched without proper oversight, fees could not be collected, and the board's authority was suspended pending full compliance. The full weight of legal and regulatory power pressed down on the HOA, leaving them paralyzed. I walked along my dock as the first boats returned under proper management. Fishermen, neighbors, and small business owners moved quietly but confidently, reclaiming the space that had once been monopolized by fear. Mr. Peters and Mrs. Carmichael were there, nodding at me, their faces reflecting relief and quiet pride. Ben Reyes launched his skiff, giving me a wave. For the first time in months, the marina felt alive, free from the suffocating control Derek had imposed. The HOA president, stripped of authority and facing mounting civil and criminal penalties, had no choice but to retreat. Derek's personal accounts were frozen, legal action loomed, and his public image was irrevocably damaged. Letters went out to the community acknowledging mismanagement and promising reforms. The board was replaced with elected officials who prioritized transparency, safety, and fairness over personal gain. In the quiet after the storm, I stood on the dock, letting the water lap against the pilings. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times infuriating, but the satisfaction was profound. Justice had been served in a way that was visible, undeniable, and permanent. Derek's arrogance had met its match, and the community had reclaimed not just a marina, but trust, safety, and the right to govern themselves. Months later, the marina was fully operational under new management. Safety drills were conducted, environmental compliance was maintained, and neighbors worked together to maintain the space. Derek's legal battles continued, but they were now remote, abstract, and powerless to undo the restoration that had taken place. I watched families, fishermen, and children enjoying the docks and boats, feeling a sense of closure that went beyond personal victory. The lake, as always, remained steady and eternal. Standing on the dock, I realized that the fight had taught me more than how to wield the law. It had reminded me why vigilance matters, why fairness must be defended, and why the quiet, stubborn determination to insist on what is right can overturn even the most entrenched power. As the sun set over the marina, I sat on the edge of my dock, feet dangling above the water, and felt a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction. The battle had been hard, the victory hard won, but it was complete. Derek had been humbled, the community restored, and my family's legacy protected. Full justice had been achieved, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under arrogance masquerading as authority. And in that moment, watching the ripples stretch across the lake, I knew that some battles are worth every sleepless night, every ounce of strategy, and every careful step. Because the truth, when wielded wisely, can be sharper than any anger, and justice, when claimed fully, leaves nothing to chance.